The last thing most people think about when they picture duck hunting is danger. They imagine quiet mornings, mist hanging over the water, flocks of mallards circling overhead, and hunters tucked into flooded timber waiting for legal shooting light. That's usually how it is. Most hunts are cold, uneventful, and end with little more than muddy boots and stories shared over breakfast. But every now and then, the woods remind you that they don't care how experienced you are. My name is Darren, and I've been hunting waterfowl in southeast Missouri for most of my life. I started chasing ducks when I was a teenager, long before I had gray creeping into my beard or a son old enough to carry his own shotgun. These days I spend my weekdays working a regular job and counting down the hours until hunting season arrives. When winter finally rolls around, every free morning becomes precious. Over the years, I've hunted plenty of public land, but one place always commanded a little more respect than the others. Mingo National Wildlife Refuge. Anyone who spent time there understands why. It's beautiful in a way that only wild places can be. Vast stretches of flooded timber, ancient cypress trees rising from dark water, hidden channels winding through the swamp. But beauty can be deceiving. Mingo is also huge, isolated, and unforgiving. The same water that attracts thousands of ducks can become dangerous in a heartbeat when the weather turns bad. The morning this happened was in late November. Winter had arrived early that year. The temperature sat somewhere in the low 20s before sunrise, and every puddle in town wore a thin sheet of ice. A steady north wind drifted through the trees, carrying that sharp cold that seems to cut through clothing and settle directly into your bones. For duck hunters, those are usually perfect conditions. The birds move better in cold weather. The problem is that humans don't. My son Tyler was with me that morning. He was 16 years old, and at that age where he was no longer a little boy but not quite a man. He could carry his own gear, handle a shotgun safely, and spend an entire morning standing in freezing water without complaint. At least most of the time. Like most teenagers, he also carried a healthy belief that nothing truly bad could happen to him. As long as Dad was around, the world still felt pretty safe. We arrived at the refuge well before shooting light. The parking lot at the Hunter check station was already filling up. Pickup trucks lined the gravel lot, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Hunters stood around in chest waders and heavy jackets, clutching steaming cups of coffee while waiting for their draw numbers to be called. It was the same ritual I'd seen 100 times before. Men swapping tired jokes. Stories about birds seen the previous day. Complaints about work. Complaints about wives. Complaints about the weather. Mostly men pretending they weren't constantly checking the clock. I signed us in, confirmed our assigned hunting area, and headed back to the truck. The gear was simple. I carried the same 12-gauge pump shotgun I'd owned for years. It wasn't fancy, but it had never failed me. It was also the gun I'd used to teach Tyler how to shoot clay pigeons when he was younger. Tyler carried his pride and joy, a 20-gauge he'd saved up for and purchased himself the previous season. Both of us were shooting factory steel loads, 3-inch shells loaded with number 2 shot. Regulations required non-toxic ammunition, and steel shot works perfectly well for ducks when used at reasonable ranges. What it isn't designed for is anything much larger. Between us, we carried maybe a dozen spare shells, enough for a successful morning hunt. Not enough for trouble. I made Tyler pack extra gloves, hand warmers, and dry socks. He rolled his eyes at half of it. I ignored him. Age teaches lessons that youth likes to argue with. One of those lessons is that being warm is far more important than looking tough. By the time we reached our assigned area, darkness still covered the timber. The moment we stepped out of the truck, the cold hit us like a wall. The air smelled of wet leaves, mud, and stagnant water. There was also that faint scent of decay that always hangs over flooded timber. Not unpleasant exactly, just the smell of nature slowly breaking itself down. We loaded our shotguns, keeping the chambers empty and safeties engaged, then slung our gear over our shoulders. I carried a bag of decoys. Tyler carried the jerk rig and game strap. Together we started down the trail. The ground was frozen just enough to crunch beneath our boots while remaining soft underneath. Every step broke through the crust with a crackle that seemed much louder than it actually was. Somewhere off to our left, another group of hunters moved through the darkness. Their headlamps drifted between the trees like distant lanterns. You couldn't see much, but you could hear them. Anyone who hunts flooded timber knows the unmistakable sound of chest waders moving through water in the dark. When the trail finally met the flooded woods, I stopped. I switched off my headlamp. For a moment, we stood in silence. The darkness wasn't complete anymore. A faint gray glow was beginning to gather in the eastern sky. Slowly, details emerged. Towering cypress trunks rose from the water like pillars. Oak trees spread skeletal branches overhead. Small ripples moved across open pockets of water as the wind whispered through the swamp. Then somewhere deep in the timber, a wood duck called. The high-pitched squeal echoed through the darkness. I smiled despite myself. No matter how old I get, that sound still makes me feel like the teenager who first fell in love with duck hunting. "Stay behind me," I said quietly. "I know, Dad." "Pick your feet up, watch for stumps." "I know." "If you find one, feel around it before stepping." He sighed dramatically. "I know." I laughed. "Good, I'm reminding you anyway." Even in the dim light, I could see him grinning. Together, we stepped into the water. The cold pressed instantly against our waders. Not enough to hurt. Enough to remind you it was there. I moved slowly, using the butt of my shotgun to probe suspicious patches of water ahead of me. Flooded timber hides all sorts of surprises beneath the surface. Fallen logs, holes, submerged branches waiting to twist an ankle. A careless step can ruin a hunt. A bad one can ruin something much worse. After several minutes of careful wadding, we reached the general area assigned to us. There was no blind waiting there. No marker. Just flooded woods stretching in every direction. That was normal. Experience teaches you what to look for. I searched for a small opening in the trees, a pocket of water where ducks could comfortably drop through the canopy. Not too deep. Enough overhead cover to make birds feel safe, but enough open sky to let them see the decoys. Finally, we found it. A small clearing surrounded by ancient timber. The kind of spot that just felt right. The kind of place where hunters convince themselves they're about to have the perfect morning. Standing there in the freezing darkness with my son beside me, listening to distant ducks stirring somewhere beyond the trees, I remember thinking exactly that. I had no idea what was waiting for us deeper in those woods. We set our gear down and got to work. Years of hunting together had turned setting decoys into a routine. We barely needed to talk anymore. Tyler knew where the jerk rig went. He knew how I liked the spread arranged. While I waded through the opening placing mallard decoys in loose groups, he worked the edge of the pocket, clipping the line to a submerged branch and making sure everything moved naturally. The water was just below my knees, cold enough to sting through the waders whenever I stood still too long. By the time we finished, the eastern horizon had begun to brighten. Not enough to see clearly, but enough that the black outlines of the trees were becoming visible. The swamp was waking up. Wood ducks squealed from somewhere farther back in the timber. A barred owl called once, then fell silent. Small rings appeared on the water as baitfish disturbed the surface. The world felt frozen between night and day. It was one of those moments hunters live for. Tyler stood beside me, rubbing his gloved hands together. "You think they'll fly today?" he asked. I laughed softly. "They're ducks, they'll fly eventually." Helpful answer. "You're welcome." He shook his head. Being 16 meant he still thought sarcasm was a personality trait. Then again, I wasn't exactly innocent on that front either. We found a pair of large cypress trees near the edge of the opening and settled in. Legal shooting light was still several minutes away. The cold seemed to deepen as we waited. A thin mist drifted across parts of the flooded timber, weaving between tree trunks like smoke. The north wind pushed gently through the branches overhead, creating a constant whispering sound. For a while, everything was perfectly normal. A few ducks moved overhead before shooting time. We could hear their wings but couldn't see them through the canopy. Then legal light arrived. The first group appeared less than 10 minutes later. 3 wood ducks. They came screaming through the trees at ridiculous speed, weaving between branches like they were born, knowing exactly where every obstacle stood. Which I suppose they were. Tyler never even got his shotgun mounted. The birds flashed through the opening and vanished. "Not even close," he muttered. I grinned. Welcome to timber hunting. The second opportunity came a few minutes later. A pair of mallards drifted over the decoys. This time, both of us were ready. The birds cupped their wings and began dropping. "Take the left one," I whispered. Tyler nodded. The shotguns roared almost together. One mallard folded instantly and crashed into the water. The second escaped through the trees. Tyler looked at me. "Mine." I nodded. "Yours." His smile was worth every early morning we'd ever shared. We retrieved the bird and settled back into position. For the next hour, hunting was steady. Not spectacular. Just good. The kind of morning most duck hunters would happily accept. A few singles, a couple pairs, some misses we'd probably laugh about later. The sun never truly broke through the clouds, leaving the swamp wrapped in a dull gray light. Around 8 o'clock, things started slowing down. The morning flight was ending. Tyler was eating a granola bar while I scanned the trees overhead. That's when I noticed something strange. Movement. Not in the air. On the water. At first, I thought it was another hunter. The flooded timber plays tricks on distance. Tree trunks break up shapes and make them difficult to identify. I squinted through the trees. The shape disappeared behind a cluster of cypress trunks, then reappeared. My first impression was that it was far larger than a hunter should have been. I frowned. "What is it?" Tyler asked. I pointed. "See that?" He followed my finger. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The shape moved again. Slowly. Deliberately. Not splashing. Not struggling through the water. Gliding. The distance made details impossible to make out. Maybe 100 yards away. Maybe more. The problem was that I couldn't figure out what I was looking at. The timber distorted everything. A fallen tree can look like a person. A person can look like a stump. A shadow can become whatever your imagination decides it should be. Still, something about it bothered me. The size. The way it moved. The fact that it seemed to pass between trees without creating much disturbance. "You think it's another hunter?" Tyler asked quietly. "I don't know." The answer surprised me. Usually I know. Years in the outdoors teach you how to identify things quickly. Deer. Coyotes. Beavers. Hunters. Most of the time, your brain sorts it out immediately. This wasn't happening now. The shape drifted behind another stand of trees and vanished completely. We waited. Nothing. A minute passed. Then two. I finally shook my head. Probably nothing. Tyler nodded, but neither of us sounded convinced. The morning continued. Another 20 minutes slipped by. A small flock of gadwalls came through and gave us something else to focus on. We dropped one bird and spent several minutes retrieving it. For a while, the strange shape faded from my mind. Then I heard the splash. It wasn't loud, just a single heavy sound somewhere behind us. I turned immediately. Every hunter develops that instinct. A squirrel dropping a nut, a deer stepping into water, a branch falling. You learn to notice sounds that don't belong. This one definitely didn't belong. Tyler turned too. The timber behind us stood silent and still. Nothing moved. Nothing called. Even the wind seemed quieter. For reasons I couldn't explain, a knot began tightening in my stomach. The same feeling you get when your brain notices a threat before your conscious mind figures out what it is. I scanned the trees. Left. Right. Behind us. Nothing. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. And somewhere deeper in the flooded timber, beyond the reach of the gray morning light, another splash echoed through the woods. Closer this time. The second splash came from somewhere behind a wall of cypress trees. Not close enough to identify. Close enough to make me uneasy. I looked at Tyler. He'd heard it too. The granola bar he'd been eating was forgotten in his hand. "What was that?" he asked. I kept scanning the timber. "Probably a deer." The words came automatically. A hunter's first instinct is always to explain away strange noises. Most of the time, there's a perfectly normal answer. A deer. A beaver. A raccoon. Another hunter moving through the woods. The problem was that none of those explanations felt right. The splash had sounded heavy. Not like an animal crashing through brush. More like something stepping directly into the water. I listened for several seconds. Nothing followed. No movement. No breaking branches. No calls from startled wildlife. Just silence. The kind of silence that makes you aware of your own breathing. Tyler looked at me. "You sure?" "No," I said quietly. I appreciated that he was old enough now to recognize when I was being honest. We stood there another minute before settling back into position. The ducks weren't flying much anymore anyway. The morning was beginning to wind down. Most hunters would start thinking about breakfast, about coffee, about getting out of the cold. I tried focusing on the hunt, but my attention kept drifting toward the trees behind us. Every few minutes, I'd glance over my shoulder. Nothing. Just endless timber. Dark trunks rising from dark water. Then came another sound. Not a splash this time. A knock. 3 sharp impacts. Talk. 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 The sound echoed faintly through the woods. Tyler immediately looked up. Woodpecker. Maybe. Except it didn't sound quite right. Anyone who spends enough time outdoors learns to recognize the rhythm of wildlife. Woodpeckers hammer rapidly, fast bursts, uneven patterns. This had been slower. Measured. Almost intentional. 3 knocks. Then silence. I felt the knot in my stomach tighten further. "Stay close," I said quietly. Tyler gave me a look. That got his attention. I didn't say things like that casually. Not anymore. The years had taught me that instincts exist for a reason. Most bad situations begin with somebody ignoring a feeling they shouldn't have ignored. We waited. Nothing happened. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. The woods gradually returned to normal. Birds called. Wind moved through the branches. A distant shotgun blast rolled across the refuge from another hunting pool. Slowly, I began feeling ridiculous. Maybe I was getting jumpy. Maybe the cold was putting me on edge. Maybe I'd simply spent too many years listening to hunting stories around campfires. I was just starting to relax when Tyler suddenly froze. "Dad." The tone of his voice instantly got my attention. I turned. His eyes weren't on me. They were fixed on something across the opening. Something in the trees. I followed his stare. At first I didn't see it. Then I did. A figure, standing motionless between two large cypress trunks, far enough away that details were impossible to make out, close enough that it was clearly there. My first thought was another hunter. The refuge wasn't private land. People occasionally wandered into the wrong pools. It happened, but something immediately felt wrong. The figure wasn't wearing blaze orange. Not unusual during waterfowl season. But I also couldn't make out any camouflage. No visible shotgun. No decoys. No movement. Just a dark shape standing knee-deep in the flooded timber. Watching. I raised a hand. The figure didn't respond. Most hunters would wave, or at least acknowledge another person. This one didn't move at all. "Dad," Tyler whispered. "I see him." The figure remained perfectly still. Seconds stretched. 5, 10, 15. Nothing. I finally cupped my hands around my mouth. "Hey." My voice echoed through the trees. No answer. The figure never moved. A strange chill crawled up my spine, and it had nothing to do with the temperature. "Maybe he's lost," Tyler said. Maybe. But I didn't believe it. Lost people move. Lost people look around. Lost people call back when someone shouts at them. This thing simply stood there, watching. Then slowly, it stepped sideways behind a tree. For a brief moment, its shape disappeared behind the trunk, when it should have emerged on the other side. Nothing appeared. The space beyond the tree was empty. I blinked, confused. The tree wasn't wide enough to completely conceal a grown man. There wasn't enough distance for someone to walk away unseen. Yet the figure was simply gone. Vanished. Neither of us spoke. I stared at the spot for several seconds. The water beyond the tree sat perfectly still. No ripples. No movement. Nothing. Finally Tyler spoke. "Where did he go?" I swallowed. "I don't know." The answer sounded wrong even to me. Because I did know one thing. No person could have disappeared that quickly. Not in flooded timber. Certainly not without making noise. We gathered our gear not long afterward. The hunt had lost its appeal. Maybe that sounds foolish. Maybe there's a logical explanation. But instinct is a powerful thing. Mine was screaming at me. The ducks could wait. Breakfast could wait. Getting out suddenly felt much more important. The walk back began quietly. I took the lead. Tyler followed close behind. The route back to the trail wasn't difficult. We'd only hunted a few hundred yards from the access path. The water pushed against our waders with each step. Branches scraped softly against our jackets. The sky had brightened enough to reveal the full gray expanse of the swamp. Visibility was better now, which should have made me feel safer. Instead, I couldn't shake the sensation that we were being followed. Several times I stopped and looked behind us. Nothing. Just trees. Water. Silence. Then halfway back to the trail, I heard footsteps. Not ours, behind us. A distinct splash. Then another. I stopped immediately. The sound stopped too. Every hair on the back of my neck stood up. I turned slowly. The flooded timber stretched away behind us. Empty. No movement. No person. No animal. Nothing. Tyler stared over my shoulder. His face had gone pale. Dad. I didn't answer, because this time I had seen it too. About 80 yards back, between the trees, a dark figure standing motionless in the water, watching us leave. And unlike before, it hadn't disappeared. It had followed us. For several seconds, neither of us moved. The figure stood among the trees, half hidden by trunks and hanging shadows, motionless except for the faint shimmer of water around its legs. The distance made details difficult. The gray morning light flattened everything into shapes and silhouettes. "What do we do?" Tyler asked quietly. His voice sounded different now. Less teenager. More kid. That caught me harder than seeing the figure itself, because Tyler wasn't easily rattled. I kept my eyes fixed on the shape. "Keep walking. You don't want to see who it is." "No." The answer came instantly. I didn't care who it was. I cared about getting my son back to the truck. The figure remained where it was as we started moving again. I forced myself not to look back every few seconds. People imagine fear as panic. Most of the time it isn't. Real fear is quiet. It narrows your focus, makes every decision feel deliberate. I concentrated on each step, the submerged roots, the hidden holes, the trees ahead. The trail wasn't far now. Another couple 100 yards and we'd be out. Behind us came a splash. Then another. My stomach tightened. I didn't need to turn around. I already knew the thing was moving. Following us. Not quickly. Not running. Just keeping pace. Splash. 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 Each step separated by several seconds. Measured. Patient. I finally glanced back. The figure had closed the distance. Not by much, but enough. What had been 80 yards now looked more like 60. Tyler saw it too. His breathing had become noticeably faster. "Dad." "I know." "What is that?" "I don't know." The truth sounded increasingly ridiculous. Hunters pride themselves on knowing the woods, knowing animals, knowing people, knowing danger. Yet standing there in the flooded timber, I had no idea what I was looking at. The shape was wrong. Too tall. Too narrow. The proportions felt off somehow. Its arms appeared unusually long. Long enough that they seemed to hang almost to its knees. Every time it stepped forward, the movement looked strangely stiff. Not natural. Not smooth. Like someone trying to imitate the way a person walks. I immediately hated that thought. The human brain is excellent at inventing nonsense when scared. I told myself exactly that. Then another splash echoed through the trees. Closer. We picked up our pace. The water made moving quickly difficult. Every step required effort. The flooded timber seemed determined to hold us in place. Branches grabbed at our jackets. Roots caught our boots. Cold water surged against our legs. And all the while, somewhere behind us, came the steady rhythm of pursuit. Splash. Pause. Splash. Pause. Splash. I risked another glance. The figure had stopped. It stood perfectly still once more. Watching. A cypress trunk partially blocked my view now, but I could still see enough. Something about its head looked wrong. I couldn't explain it. The shape seemed too large, too elongated, almost as if the neck was longer than it should have been. I blinked, the illusion vanished. For a moment it looked normal again. Just a distant person. Just a hunter. Just somebody standing in the woods. Then it moved its head, and my heart nearly stopped. Because the movement wasn't human. The head tilted sideways, at an angle no person's neck should comfortably manage. The figure remained frozen in place, while its head slowly leaned to one side, studying us like a curious animal. A rush of adrenaline hit me so hard my hands went numb. "Keep moving," I said. Tyler didn't argue. We practically shoved our way through the next stretch of timber. The trail had to be close. It had to be. I knew these woods. I knew exactly where we were. Yet somehow the distance felt longer than before. Every shadow seemed darker. Every tree looked identical. The refuge had transformed from familiar hunting ground into something alien. Then we heard a voice. A man's voice. Faint. Somewhere ahead. "Morning." I froze. Then relief flooded through me. Another hunter. Real people. Real voices. The spell shattered instantly. I shouted back. "Hey." A few moments later, two hunters emerged from the trees ahead, carrying decoy bags and shotguns as they headed toward the parking area. I've never been happier to see strangers. The older man looked at us and frowned. "You boys all right?" I realized then how we must have looked. Breathing hard. Faces pale. Moving far faster than two hunters, leaving a decent morning hunt should have been. "Yeah," I said. The lie came automatically. The man glanced past us into the timber. "What pool were you hunting?" I told him. His expression changed slightly. Just for a moment. Then he nodded. "Gotcha." Something about the reaction caught my attention. "Why?" The hunter hesitated. His partner shifted uncomfortably. Then the older man shrugged. "Nothing." People say nothing when they absolutely mean something. I knew it. He knew I knew it. For a second, I thought he might continue. Instead, he adjusted the strap on his shoulder. "Y'all have a good one." And just like that, they moved past us. Tyler watched them disappear. "Dad." "I know. You saw his face, right?" I had. The man hadn't looked confused when I mentioned our hunting area. He'd looked concerned. Maybe even worried. We resumed walking, this time with another pair of hunters somewhere behind us on the trail. That should have made me feel better. It didn't. Because after several minutes, curiosity got the better of me. I stopped, turned, and looked back one final time. The flooded timber stretched away beneath the gray sky. Silent. Still. Empty. The figure was gone. Completely gone. No movement. No ripples. Nothing. Yet even as relief washed over me, another realization settled in. The two hunters who had passed us should have been visible somewhere behind. The water was shallow. The woods weren't that dense. We should have been able to see them. Instead, they too had vanished from sight. Every one of them. As if the swamp had swallowed them whole. I didn't say a word. I simply turned back toward the trail and kept walking. For the first time in my life, I wanted absolutely nothing to do with Mingo National Wildlife Refuge. And the truly disturbing part, the day wasn't over yet. The truck came into view about 15 minutes later. I've never been so happy to see a muddy pickup parked in a gravel lot. The moment we reached it, I felt some of the tension begin to ease. Civilization has a funny way of doing that. A vehicle, a road, other people, simple things that remind you the world still makes sense. Tyler tossed his gear into the bed without his usual care. His shotgun went into its case. The decoys followed. Neither of us said much. The silence wasn't comfortable. It was the kind people share after experiencing something they haven't quite figured out yet. Finally, as I started the engine and turned the heater on, Tyler spoke. "You saw it too, right?" I looked at him. "What part?" "The way it moved." I didn't answer immediately, because I'd been asking myself the same question. The human mind wants certainty. It wants clean explanations, especially after fear. Part of me desperately wanted to convince myself we'd seen another hunter. A strange hunter, maybe. An awkward hunter. Someone who'd happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. But every time I replayed the encounter, the details refused to fit. The silence, the distance it covered, the way it had appeared and disappeared, that unnatural tilt of its head. "I don't know what I saw," I admitted. Tyler stared out the windshield. We drove toward the check station. Most hunters stop there before leaving to report birds and check out of their assigned pools. The parking lot was busier now. Groups were returning from morning hunts. Men stood around comparing limits and telling stories. The normal sounds of a successful hunting morning. For a while, I almost convinced myself we'd imagined the entire thing. Then we walked inside. An older refuge employee sat behind the counter reviewing paperwork. Gray hair, weathered face. The kind of man who looked like he'd spent most of his life outdoors. He asked the usual questions. How many birds? What species? How the hunting had been. I answered automatically. Then, before I could stop myself, I mentioned the figure. Not directly, just casually. The way someone brings up something strange without wanting to sound ridiculous. "We saw somebody wandering around our pool this morning." The employee looked up. "What pool?" I told him. His eyes stayed on me for a second longer than necessary. Then he looked back down at his paperwork. Probably another hunter. The answer came too quickly. Tyler noticed it too. I could tell. "Maybe," I said. The employee nodded, but he didn't sound convinced. Neither did I. For a few moments, nobody spoke. Then an older hunter, standing near the coffee station, chuckled. "You boys see the timber walker?" The room went quiet. Not completely. Just enough. Enough for me to notice. Enough for the employee behind the counter to suddenly become interested in his paperwork again. I turned toward the hunter. He looked to be in his late 60s. Lean. Sunburned. The sort of man who'd spent decades in boats and marshes. "The what?" The hunter smiled. Not a happy smile. The kind people wear when discussing something they don't entirely believe, but don't entirely dismiss either. "The timber walker." Another hunter near the door rolled his eyes. "Don't start that nonsense." The older man shrugged. "I'm just saying." "Saying what?" I asked. The room remained strangely quiet. The old hunter took a sip of coffee. Then he nodded toward the refuge map hanging on the wall. Every few years somebody sees something out there. The employee behind the counter immediately cut in. People see lots of things. The hunter ignored him, usually in the flooded timber. Nobody laughed. That bothered me more than anything. Stories are one thing. Stories usually earn smiles, jokes, arguments, not silence. See what? Tyler asked. The hunter looked directly at him. A tall man. I felt my stomach tighten. The hunter continued. Sometimes folks say he's a hunter. He paused. Sometimes they say he ain't. The room remained still. One of the younger hunters shook his head. That's just swamp stories. Maybe. The old man took another sip. But it's funny how the descriptions stay the same. Nobody responded. The old hunter looked at me. How tall was yours? I hesitated, then answered. Tall. The man's expression didn't change. Long arms. My mouth suddenly felt dry. Yeah. Tyler looked at me. I looked at him. Neither of us had mentioned that detail. Not to anyone. The old hunter nodded slowly. Then he looked away, as if the conversation was over. I stood there trying to decide whether to ask more questions. Part of me wanted answers. Part of me didn't. The employee behind the counter finally sighed. You boys need to get home. The words sounded oddly firm, almost like advice. Or a warning. I signed the checkout sheet. We gathered our gear. Then we left. Outside, the cold air hit us again. The parking lot looked perfectly ordinary. Trucks, hunters, dogs barking in the distance. Everything normal. Everything safe. We were halfway to the pickup when Tyler suddenly stopped. I followed his gaze. Beyond the edge of the parking area stood a line of trees. Nothing unusual, except for a single figure standing among them. Far away, partially hidden, watching. My pulse immediately spiked. The figure remained motionless, just like before. Tall, thin, silent. I blinked. A truck passed between us. When it cleared, the figure was gone. Tyler looked at me. Neither of us spoke, because there was nothing left to say. A few minutes later, we were driving away from Mingo. The refuge disappeared in the rearview mirror. The trees grew smaller. The swamp faded into the distance. Eventually, Tyler fell asleep in the passenger seat. I should have relaxed. Instead, I found myself checking the mirrors every few minutes, watching the empty road behind us, watching for something impossible, something that had no business existing. And somewhere deep down, a thought I couldn't shake kept returning. What if it hadn't been following us because we were leaving? What if it had been making sure we did? For the next few weeks, I tried not to think about it. Life has a way of helping with that. Work needed doing. Bills needed paying. The holidays were approaching. Between overtime shifts and family obligations, the strange morning at Mingo slowly drifted toward the back of my mind. Not completely. Just far enough away that I could pretend it wasn't bothering me. Tyler handled it differently. Teenagers are strange creatures. One minute they're terrified. The next they're treating the experience like some kind of mystery they need to solve. A few days after the hunt, I walked into the living room and found him staring at his laptop. What are you doing? He immediately minimized the screen, which told me everything I needed to know. What are you researching? Nothing. You're researching something. He sighed. The refuge. I rubbed my forehead. Of course he was. And he hesitated, then reopened the browser. The screen contained search results, old hunting forums, local message boards, archived newspaper clippings. Most of it was nonsense. Stories about strange lights, missing hunters, ghosts, Bigfoot, the usual collection of things that appear whenever enough people spend time in isolated places. But one article caught my attention, not because it was supernatural, because it wasn't. The article described a hunter who had gone missing decades earlier. The details were sparse. A man entered the flooded timber alone and never returned. Search teams found his boat, his decoys, even his shotgun, but not him. Cases like that happen more often than people realize. Swamps are dangerous. People drown. People get lost. Nature doesn't always return what it takes. Still, I found myself reading the article twice. Then a third time. "See," Tyler said. "See what?" "People disappear out there." I closed the laptop. People disappear everywhere. The answer sounded reasonable. Unfortunately, I wasn't entirely convinced by it myself. Winter passed. Hunting season ended. Spring arrived. Life moved on. For a while, the encounter became just another strange story. Something we'd occasionally mention over dinner. Something we'd laugh about when enough time had passed. Eventually, even Tyler stopped bringing it up. The world settled back into normal. Then the following season arrived, and we made the mistake of going back. Not to the same pool. Not even close. But back to Mingo. Looking back now, I don't know whether that was courage or stupidity. Probably a little of both. Human beings are remarkably talented at convincing themselves unpleasant experiences were exaggerated. A year later, the memory feels softer, less threatening. You tell yourself you overreacted, that the whole event wasn't as strange as it seemed. So when duck season opened again, we returned. The morning couldn't have been more different. The weather was milder. The sky was clear. The refuge looked beautiful, exactly the way it appears in brochures and wildlife magazines. By mid-morning, we'd already taken a few birds. Everything felt normal. Around 9 o'clock, we stopped for a break. We were sitting against a pair of cypress trees, eating snacks when Tyler suddenly laughed. "What?" He pointed. "Remember last year?" I groaned. "We agreed not to talk about that." He grinned. "You know what the weirdest part was? The whole thing. The old hunter." "Yeah." I nodded. "What about him?" Tyler looked thoughtful. "I never saw him leave." Something about the statement made me pause. "What do you mean?" "The guy at the check station." I shrugged. The way he said it immediately got my attention. Tyler sat forward. The parking lot wasn't that crowded. So after we talked to him, I watched. I frowned. "Watched what?" "The old hunter." A breeze moved through the trees overhead. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then Tyler continued. "He never walked out." I stared at him. "You're sure?" He nodded. "I thought about it later." The grin was gone now. "I saw us leave. I saw the refuge employee. I saw the younger hunters. But I never saw the old guy leave." I opened my mouth to answer, then stopped, because I suddenly realized something. Neither had I. The memory returned with uncomfortable clarity. The old hunter had been standing beside the coffee station. Then we'd walked outside. After that, nothing. No goodbye. No truck. No departure. Just absence. I forced a laugh. You're reading too much into it. Yet neither of us seemed eager to continue the conversation. A few minutes later, we packed our things and resumed hunting. The day remained uneventful. No strange figures. No mysterious sounds. No unsettling encounters. By afternoon, we were heading back toward the parking area. The refuge once again seemed perfectly ordinary. And that's exactly why what happened next hit so hard. We were maybe a quarter mile from the truck when we passed a weathered information board near one of the access trails. The display contained photographs from the refuge's history. Old black and white images. Conservation projects. Flood control work. Hunters from decades past. The kind of thing most people glance at for 5 seconds before moving on. Tyler stopped. "Dad." There was something in his voice. Something sharp. I turned. He was staring at one of the photographs. A black and white picture from some time in the 1970s. The image showed a group of hunters standing beside a check station. All smiling. All holding ducks. Normal. Except for one man. An older hunter standing near the edge of the group. Thin. Weathered. Wearing an old hunting jacket. My blood turned to ice. Because I recognized him immediately. The coffee station hunter. The man who had asked how tall our figure was. The man who knew about the long arms. The man who called it the timber walker. I stepped closer. The caption sat beneath the photograph. Faded but readable. The names of the hunters appeared in a list. One name had been marked with a small note. A memorial notation added years later. The man had died. Not recently. Not last year. Not even last decade. According to the plaque, he drowned in the refuge more than 20 years earlier. And yet both Tyler and I would have sworn we'd spoken to him face to face the year before, inside the check station, while he drank coffee and smiled. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. The sounds of the refuge seemed to fade into the background. Wind moved through the trees. A duck called somewhere over the water. A truck door slammed in the distance. All normal sounds, yet standing there, none of it felt normal anymore. I stepped closer to the photograph. The face was unmistakable. Older. A little thinner, maybe. But it was him. The same sharp cheekbones. The same narrow smile. The same eyes. The man we'd spoken to at the check station. The man who seemed to know exactly what we'd seen. The man the plaque claimed had been dead for over 20 years. There has to be another explanation, I said. Mostly to myself. Tyler didn't answer. He was staring at the picture with the same expression I probably wore. The expression people have when reality refuses to cooperate. Eventually we walked away. What else could we do? Argue with a photograph. Track down refuge records. Demand answers from people who probably didn't have any. The older I get, the more I realize that some mysteries stay mysteries. The world doesn't owe us explanations. Sometimes it simply hands us questions and walks away. That should have been the end of it. In many ways it was. We continued hunting over the next few seasons. Not often at Mingo, but occasionally. Neither of us ever saw the figure again. At least not clearly. Once or twice, I thought I caught movement in the flooded timber. A shape between distant trees. A silhouette standing where nobody should have been standing. But every time I looked again, there was nothing there. Eventually, I stopped looking. Tyler did too. Life moved forward. He graduated high school, started building a life of his own. The years passed. The story became something we rarely discussed. Not because we forgot, because neither of us had anything new to add. Then 3 winters ago, something happened that brought it all rushing back. I was hunting alone. Not at Mingo, a smaller conservation area about 40 miles away. The morning had been slow, cloudy, cold, the sort of day where you spend more time thinking than hunting. By noon, I had packed my gear and started the walk back to the truck. Halfway there, I stopped to rest beside a flooded ditch. As I stood there, I noticed something carved into the bark of an old cypress. At first, I thought it was just initials. Hunters leave marks everywhere. Names, dates, the occasional attempt at artwork. This was different. The carving was old. Very old. The bark had grown around it over time. I stepped closer. The shape wasn't a name. It wasn't initials. It was a figure. A crude drawing. Tall, thin, long arms hanging nearly to its knees. I stared at it for a long time. The carving looked decades old. Possibly older. Old enough that whoever created it was probably gone. Yet the image was instantly recognizable. Someone else had seen it. Long before me. Long before Tyler. Long before the old hunter who'd spoken about the timber walker. Someone had seen it and felt compelled to leave a warning behind. Or perhaps a record. Proof that they weren't imagining things. I never told Tyler about the carving. I don't know why. Maybe because by then he had a wife. A career. A life far removed from flooded timber and old ghost stories. Maybe because I didn't want to pull him back into something we'd both worked hard to leave behind. Or maybe because I was afraid of what he might say. These days, when people ask about the strangest thing I've encountered while hunting, I usually tell them a different story. Something funny. Something believable. Nobody wants to hear about a silent figure standing in flooded woods. Nobody wants to hear about dead hunters appearing in check stations. Nobody wants to hear about ancient carvings hidden in swamp trees. And honestly, I don't blame them. Most days, I barely believe it myself. But every year, when duck season arrives and the mornings turn cold, I find myself thinking about Mingo. About the flooded timber. About that gray November morning. About the thing that followed us through the trees. And most of all, I think about something the old hunter said. Not his words. His expression. The look on his face when I described what we'd seen. It wasn't fear. It wasn't surprise. It wasn't even curiosity. It was recognition. The expression of a man hearing a story he'd heard many times before. As though the figure in the woods wasn't unusual at all. As though it had always been there. Waiting among the cypress trees. Watching hunters come and go. Season after season. Generation after generation. Part of the swamp. Part of the history. Part of something older than any of us. Maybe that's the real reason nobody talks about it much anymore. Not because people don't see it, but because deep down, they understand something they can't explain. Some places belong to us. Some places never did. And if you spend enough time in the flooded timber of southeast Missouri, standing knee-deep in black water beneath trees older than your grandparents, you may eventually get the feeling that you're not the one doing the watching. You're the one being watched. If that's true, then I hope the thing we encountered that morning was simply making sure we left. Because the alternative is far harder to live with. The alternative is that it never stopped watching at all. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. The sounds of the refuge seemed to fade into the background. Wind moved through the trees. A duck called somewhere over the water. A truck door slammed in the distance. All normal sounds. Yet standing there in front of that weathered display board, none of it felt normal anymore. I stepped closer to the photograph. The face was unmistakable. Older. A little thinner, maybe. But it was him. The same sharp cheekbones. The same narrow smile. The same eyes. The man we'd spoken to at the check station. The man who seemed to know exactly what we'd seen. The man the plaque claimed had been dead for over 20 years. There has to be another explanation, I said. Mostly to myself. Tyler didn't answer. He was staring at the picture with the same expression I probably wore. The expression people have when reality refuses to cooperate. Eventually, we walked away. What else could we do? Argue with a photograph? Track down refuge records? Demand answers from people who probably didn't have any? The older I get, the more I realize that some mysteries stay mysteries. The world doesn't owe us explanations. Sometimes it simply hands us questions and walks away. That should have been the end of it. In many ways, it was. We continued hunting over the next few seasons. Not often at Mingo, but occasionally. Neither of us ever saw the figure again. At least not clearly. Once or twice, I thought I caught movement in the flooded timber. A shape between distant trees. A silhouette standing where nobody should have been standing. But every time I looked again, there was nothing there. Eventually, I stopped looking. Tyler did too. Life moved forward. He graduated high school. Started building a life of his own. The years passed. The story became something we rarely discussed. Not because we forgot. Because neither of us had anything new to add. Then 3 winters ago, something happened that brought it all rushing back. I was hunting alone. Not at Mingo. A smaller conservation area about 40 miles away. The morning had been slow. Cloudy. Cold. The sort of day where you spend more time thinking than hunting. By noon, I had packed my gear and started the walk back to the truck. Halfway there, I stopped to rest beside a flooded ditch. As I stood there, I noticed something carved into the bark of an old cypress. At first, I thought it was just initials. Hunters leave marks everywhere. Names. Dates. The occasional attempt at artwork. This was different. The carving was old. The bark had grown around it over time. I stepped closer. The shape wasn't a name. It wasn't initials. It was a figure. A crude drawing. Tall. Thin. Long arms hanging nearly to its knees. I stared at it for a long time. The carving looked decades old. Possibly older. Old enough that whoever created it was probably gone. Yet the image was instantly recognizable. Someone else had seen it. Long before me. Long before Tyler. Long before the old hunter who'd spoken about the timber walker. Someone had seen it and felt compelled to leave a warning behind. Or perhaps a record. Proof that they weren't imagining things. I never told Tyler about the carving. I don't know why. Maybe because by then he had a wife. A career. A life far removed from flooded timber and old ghost stories. Maybe because I didn't want to pull him back into something we'd both worked hard to leave behind. Or maybe because I was afraid of what he might say. These days, when people ask about the strangest thing I've encountered while hunting, I usually tell them a different story. Something funny. Something believable. Nobody wants to hear about a silent figure standing in flooded woods. Nobody wants to hear about dead hunters appearing in check stations. Nobody wants to hear about ancient carvings hidden in swamp trees. And honestly, I don't blame them. Most days, I barely believe it myself. But every year, when duck season arrives and the mornings turn cold, I find myself thinking about Mingo, about the flooded timber, about that gray November morning, about the thing that followed us through the trees. And most of all, I think about something the old hunter said. Not his words, his expression, the look on his face when I described what we'd seen. It wasn't fear. It wasn't surprise. It wasn't even curiosity. It was recognition. The expression of a man hearing a story he'd heard many times before. As though the figure in the woods wasn't unusual at all. As though it had always been there, waiting among the cypress trees, watching hunters come and go, season after season, generation after generation. Part of the swamp, part of the history, part of something older than any of us. Maybe that's the real reason nobody talks about it much anymore. Not because people don't see it, but because deep down, they understand something they can't explain. Some places belong to us. Some places never did. And if you spend enough time in the flooded timber of southeast Missouri, standing knee-deep in black water beneath trees older than your grandparents, you may eventually get the feeling that you're not the one doing the watching. If that's true, then I hope the thing we encountered that morning was simply making sure we left. Because the alternative is far harder to live with. The alternative is that it never stopped watching at all.